Moments ago, a federal judge has ruled in the biggest case growing out of the Mueller report, ordering former White House counsel Don McGahn, the star witness of the Mueller report, to testify before Congress. As you probably know if you follow the news, this is a big decision that affects not only issues in the Mueller case, but the open impeachment probe, implications for many other White House officials and potential witnesses and Trump allies who have in various ways been delaying or refusing to testify in the impeachment probe into the alleged Ukraine bribery plot. We and our experts are poring over this decision, and given that it's breaking news, we're going to bring them right in. Former acting U.S. Solicitor General Neil Katyal, who's argued dozens of cases before the Supreme Court, including these kinds of interbranch issues. He also has a brand new book out, Impeach, the case against Donald Trump, coming out tomorrow. Harvard professor Leah Wright Rigueur, and David Frum, a former speechwriter for George W. Bush, now at The Atlantic. Good evening to everyone. Neil, this is a decision many had been waiting on. We have not read all of it, but we have read some of it. Your view of the core news, the core holding here?
Yeah, so it's only come out 5 minutes ago, so I want to caution everyone. Everyone's got to study it. But boy, it looks like a complete win for Nancy Pelosi in the House of Representatives and a very devastating loss for the president. What the judge has done is the judge in D.C. has said that she's followed an earlier precedent by Judge Bates, a very respected judge appointed by Republican President Bush in D.C. to say that Harriet Miers had to testify. And similarly here, this judge has said now Don McGahn has to testify. That has massive implications because McGahn is all over some of the concerns about the cover-up that happened back with the Mueller investigation. So that's one thing, Ari. But the other, even more important thing is that it's speculated that this may change the dynamics about whether or not former National Security Advisor John Bolton will now testify, and other folks. Remember, he had asked a court to say, hey, I'm not sure if I can testify or not. And it looks like this ruling's logic and reasoning is saying, oh, no, you got to testify. I mean, Trump made some absurd legal arguments saying that he was absolutely immune and his advisors couldn't testify. And this judge appears to have rejected all of that.
Yeah, Neil, you say all that, and as you mentioned, and I'll remind viewers as well, we are just getting, as we do on big Supreme Court days, we get a long ruling and we make sense of the high points. But I'm also, in the spirit of legal analysis and reporting, going to read some of what at the end looks like a very stark siding with the powers of Congress. Obviously, this Congress being run by Speaker Pelosi, as you say, to compel this kind of testimony. Reading from this, again, moments ago, just got the ruling. The judge saying, look, this echoes the Miers decision, as you mentioned, that was from a different era. The court adds, this is an inescapable conclusion because the subpoena is a legal construct, not a political one. And this is pretty significant, Neil, when you think about the debates we're having. It says, quote, no one is above the law.
Right. Yeah.
The reference there being to the potential civil defendant, Mr. McGahn, is not above the law. Do you read the reference that way?
I read it that way, but I read it more broadly. I mean, this opinion, just from the few minutes I've looked at it, is a rejoinder to the era of Trumpism, to the idea that absolute power means you, as a president, you can do whatever you want. And that was literally the president's argument in this case. He's absolutely immune from legal process. And I can't think of something more un-American. And Judge Jackson, following her predecessor, Judge Bates, appears to have reached the exact same conclusion.
And David Frum, who's obviously served in a White House, including the one that the Miers precedent reaches, no one in any courtroom or in any Congress would say that a subpoena means every single topic must be discussed. There are later protections for that. This was the more initial issue, or what lawyers would call the threshold issue, of whether this witness even comes before Congress in any valid way. And again, reading from a part of the opinion I haven't read yet, it says, when a duly authorized committee of Congress issues a valid subpoena to a current or former executive official, and a federal court determines that they, as a matter of law, have a duty to respond, the constitutional principles that animate the structure of our government are preserved. Your view, David, of the judge coming down in that way, that's saying this is bigger than what McGahn did, what he can and can't say. There are obviously some real privilege issues that would yet to be determined, but that it is in the interest of the U.S. constitutional order that Mr. McGahn and, as Neil said, potentially other people like Mr. Bolton ultimately face Congress.
Well, one of my longstanding worries about the Trump presidency was that President Trump's extreme claims in bad cases were going to take a lot of issues that had always been kind of blurry, exactly the limits of executive privilege. These questions have been blurry because they've tended not to be litigated, that the branches have mutually adjusted rather than refer to them to the court. And President Trump has made a series of outrageous, as Neil said, broad, crazy claims about presidential power. He's doing it obviously to cover up wrongdoing. And so the courts, how can they do anything otherwise than sharply limit presidential power? But someday we're going to need that presidential power for good ends. And I worry a lot that President Trump, by trying to corrupt the presidency, is going to end up leaving behind an institutionally weakened presidency against future Congresses with a lot of case law that says Congress can do more than we imagined 3 or 4 years ago that Congress could do.
Well, it's funny to hear you say that on a night like tonight when, again, for viewers just joining us, the White House getting a real stinging rebuke and loss in federal court, ordering Mueller star witness Don McGahn to testify before Congress, an issue live and in the heart of the impeachment probe. But, David, you're also partly echoing the concerns of another conservative former colleague of yours, Jack Goldsmith, who has argued, and he's known as a conservative, able legal mind, but he said what you've said, that basically if you die on too many hills and you fight too many fights with bad arguments for executive power, you actually, he argues, Trump actually weakens the presidency.
Right. Well, we're going, one of the questions that has always been obscure in American history is what are the president's criminal liabilities in state law? The shoot the man on Fifth Avenue claim. And it's kind of blurry because weirdly, we've gotten through all these years of the Republic without litigating it because presidents have gotten through all these years of the Republic without committing any state crimes to litigate it. When you have a president who then commits a lot of state crimes, it raises a question. And probably we're going to end up with a Supreme Court ruling that, yes, the president is subject to state criminal process during his presidency. That's a bad outcome from my point of view, from a public policy point of view. It was better never to have tested it, to have left it blurry. But the way you don't test it is you don't commit crimes, and that seems too high a bar for this White House.
And Ari, if I could...
Well, you put that, Neil, I want to get Leah in and then come back to you, but just Professor Agor, who's riding along with us, I'll do what I've been doing in this ruling, which is read another new part to you and to our viewers that's brand new when we get breaking news. This is a little interesting to me because, again, what Don McGahn did was cooperate with Mueller. Indeed, Mueller gave him a lot of credit for that cooperation. He is more cited than anyone else in the Mueller report. And so on that level, he got a good grade. Then he went ahead and fought this fight to not cooperate with the Congress. And so this is interesting in that context, as I read to you from this judge siding with Pelosi over the Trump folks, saying the law has remained the same from the Bush era, when then counsel Harriet Miers did not have absolute immunity to testify, and it remains the state of the law today. And then, Professor, this judge writes, quote, it goes without saying the law applies to Don McGahn, just as it does to other current and former senior-level White House officials. I don't think you need to be a scholar to note that that is a big red flag for John Bolton, because this is basically saying nobody, right, not the lawyers, not the national security, nobody has absolute immunity, Professor.
I think it's a big red flag for everyone right now. And if I were in the Trump administration, I'd be running around in a panic. Either that or I'd be furious. It's a slippery slope. It opens the door for not simply just, subpoenas of high-level officials, but also tosses out the idea that people can be exempt. So it creates a way of going after not only the people that we are talking about, say McGahn, who we're talking about with regard to the Mueller investigation, but also has applications and has consequences or results for the current impeachment inquiry that is happening right now. So, if you're John Bolton, you should be paying careful attention to this, because this may change, your Friday night plans this week. But I think there's something else, too, that's really important. We've been in the midst of what we might call a constitutional crisis, or the beginnings of a constitutional crisis. I think this puts us full speed ahead into a constitutional crisis, because we know that the Trump administration is not going to respond well to this, and we know that they're going to do everything within their power not to agree with the court and not to comply with the court. So it'll be interesting to see what they do going forward.
Neil, I know you wanted to get in as well.
So the big question, in the light of what David said a moment ago, which is the Trump's actions here so risk this important resource of executive privilege, executive power. The question is, why would he do it? And I think the answer is, and we're seeing this both in the context of McGahn, but also in the context of impeachment, in which he's stonewalled Congress and said 0 documents, 0 witnesses is one thing. He's got a lot to hide. A lot to hide. And this is going to change, I think, not just the McGahn and Mueller and all that stuff. I think this changes the dynamics of impeachment, Ari, as well, because it puts the finger back on Trump's conduct in really trying to undermine the investigation. And there's all this talk about whether Congress is going to add an obstruction of justice count. And this kind of pattern of behavior, even though it's a separate investigation, it's about Mueller, it's a kind of the same basic pattern, which is, hey, I don't have to bother showing up to Congress. I can gag all of my employees. I can prevent all the documents from coming over because I can just on my own declare this investigation illegitimate. And what the judge appears to have done is say, not in America. You have legitimate investigations by the Congress of the United States, and those will go forward, and you will provide that evidence and testimony.
And Neil, the other thing that I'm reading as I'm going through this, and it's always tricky to read a case on live TV, but we do it from time to time, all of us here together, so ride with us. On page 39, I see a judge really shredding what has become known to some degree as Bill Barr's unitary executive theory. He's not the only one, but he's embraced it. He just gave quite the controversial speech about some of these very issues. And footnote 11 likens part of the DOJ's position to the animals in Animal Farm. It quotes the DOJ position and then says, for a similar vantage point, consider the circumstances described by, quote, George Orwell in the acclaimed book Animal Farm, and goes on to say that basically, unfortunately for the DOJ, while there are strong executive powers in this country, the way that they've made contentions, quote, the Trump administration has, quote, distorted separation of powers principles, quote, beyond all recognition. Now, Neil, I would caution for viewers, this isn't a Supreme Court opinion. We're not rewriting the entire balance here. But what does it say to you in a case that is likely to go up and up the line, that the judge is putting this marker down against these Barr DOJ claims?
Right. So, Ari, I doubt this case will actually get to the Supreme Court because I think the Supreme Court, these arguments are so silly that I just don't think the Supreme Court is likely to take them in the end. But I think that's the ultimate point. There's a legitimate theory, the unitary executive theory. It's one I and a lot of people believe, which has nothing to do with what Bill Barr said. It's about administrative agencies and stuff like that. What Barr has said is something that no responsible constitutional scholar in our history has ever adopted, which is the idea that the president on his own can basically run the government and be immune from any sort of second guessing or criticism. He can't be indicted and he can't even be investigated. And by the way, they say he can't be impeached because that would be a coup. So, it's King George III plus is what basically what Barr is advocating for. And I think the judge today appears to have said, along with the overwhelming consensus of people in this country, scholars from the left and the right, this is ridiculous. I mean, these kinds of views are really written in crayon. They're not written in any sort of analytically sophisticated or even accurate way.
And Neil, and then David, I'm reading now again, breaking news, a response from William Burke, the attorney for Don McGahn, who says McGahn will, quote, comply with Judge Jackson's decision unless it's stayed pending appeal. The DOJ is handling this case. You'll need to ask them whether they intend to seek a stay. Neil?
Yeah, so Burke is an excellent lawyer. That's exactly the right response. Unfortunately, this Justice Department has really sided with the president in ways that I've never seen before in my life. Normally the Justice Department is supposed to have some insulation and independence, and not make crazy crayon arguments. But that's unfortunately what they've been doing. So I suspect that they will try and appeal this to the Court of Appeals in D.C. I expect they will lose quickly. I think the House of Representatives will say, look, you want to appeal, fine, but let's brief this thing in under a week. We're ready to argue. We're ready to go. And I expect a quick ruling from the D.C. Circuit as well. That's what happened in the Nixon tapes case. Everything start to finish was 3 months, and that one went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And as I say, I think this one, the president's arguments are so weak, I just don't see it going to the Supreme Court in its current posture.
David, and then Leah?
I think Donald Trump has arranged a schedule so that he is going to open 2020 with the longest string of losing presidential cases I think we've probably ever seen, both in his public and his private capacity. He's going to be losing cases on business documents. He's going to be losing cases on tax returns. And he has, by stonewalling it so long and successfully stonewalling it so long, he's actually created a situation where he's going to have the worst possible timing for himself, where all of these things are going to be coming into the light of day just as the American people focus on an election year.
Leah?
Yeah, so I completely agree with this. I think I'd also point out that it shows a kind of resiliency around our American democratic institutions. So even as we have these larger questions about, stonewalling, about the role of the executive office, about the ways in which Donald Trump has had a complete disregard for law, that again and again, the courts and the institutions surrounding the courts have shown a kind of resiliency around answering this question. On top of that, I think two, one of the things that, we talked about earlier in this conversation, Donald Trump does have a lot to hide, that we wouldn't be having these questions if the documents, the courts, the institutions didn't keep revealing misdoings, misdeeds, and at the very least, unethical behaviors. So now what we're beginning to see, too, as these things come down the pipeline, is that it's painting a picture that is deeply damning for the American people, and that is forcing people to pick a side, whether it be, this president is corrupt, or to showcase their partisan loyalty. So ignoring all of the evidence in front of them.
So much to think about here, and so well guided by our experts, Leah Wright Rigueur, Neil Katyal, and David Frum. I should mention, Neil, congratulations on the new book. Thanks to all our guests. Let me tell you, if you're joining us here on a busy Monday night, what's happening? We had one show planned. We threw it out the window, and we have a lot more on this breaking news. What I am holding is that very rare thing. It is an order for Don McGahn, a former top White House counsel of the president, Donald Trump, to testify. Reading from it, it says McGahn, quote, is not immune from compelled congressional process, that he has no lawful basis for refusing to appear for congressional testimony before Speaker Pelosi's House. That's something that you probably know has been fought tooth and nail by the Trump DOJ and Mr. McGahn here for quite some time, and that he is ordered to appear. As you can imagine, this sets off implications for the obstruction part of the Mueller probe investigation and the open issues in impeachment. The timing, well, we don't make it up, we just respond to it. So, hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.